Hi everyone, and welcome to BookNet Canada's webinar on transitioning from ONIX 2.1 to 3.0. I'm Zelina Alvi, the Community Manager at BookNet Canada. If you're having any questions or technical issues during the presentation, just go ahead and chat me in the chat feature directly to BookNet Canada. Otherwise, we'll get started. So over the next hour, you'll be learning about the differences between ONIX 2.1 and 3.0, which changes are easy to make, which will take more planning, and how to get started. Presenting and taking questions today will be Graham Bell. He is the Executive Director of the Global ONIX Standards Organization EDItEUR. Prior to being Executive Director, he served as the Chief Data Architect there, where he focused on the continuing development and application of ONIX for books, and on other EDItEUR standards for both the book and serial sectors. He previously worked for HarperCollins Publishers in the UK, where most recently he was Head of Publishing Systems. He has over a decade of experience with ONIX for books. So we'll do a Q&A at the end, probably right around 2 p.m. So during the presentation, please send any questions you may have directly to BookNet Questions using the chat feature and just select them from the bottom of that box. And we'll choose a few at the end to ask Graham. So now I will pass things off to Graham.
So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to BookNet Canada for this opportunity to present this. Good afternoon to everybody else. And this is a presentation I've given several times before, both in the UK, particularly to audiences through book industry communication in the UK, and also to audiences in the US through the Book Industry Study Group. And I know a few people from Canadian organisations have attended one or other of those. So let's, first of all, ensure that we're all on the same page. Let's understand how we got to where we are and where ONIX came from. I suppose I can trace the roots of ONIX back to around about 1996, 1997. In that period, there were two particular projects that led more or less directly to ONIX. The first of them was called BIC Basic. Now, this was I hesitate to call it a standard. I suppose it was a standard. It was, in effect, a recommended set of metadata elements. Not rocket science stuff, simple stuff like title, subtitle, author names, pub date, and so on. About 11 or maybe up to 15 data elements, depending how you counted them. Now, BIC Basic recommended this list, but it didn't recommend a way of communicating them. It didn't specify a file format, so you could use whatever you wanted. It was just a simple list that said, these are the things that, if you are a publisher, you must tell your retailers. Simply, the trade won't work without these 11 or 15 data elements. But they were just names, title, subtitle, and so on. Now, the other project, EPIX, was linked to it. This was the EDItEUR Product Information Communication Standard. A slight odd name because it wasn't a standard, and to be honest, it wasn't really much about communication either. It was, in effect, a set of definitions that could be linked to those element names in BIC Basic. So it told you what you meant by a title or a subtitle. It defined what pub date was. Now, neither EPIX nor BIC Basic was ONIX. Neither of them was about communication. 1998, another two projects. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, the XML specification was released by the World Wide Web Consortium. And secondly, there was a project called INDEX, which was funded by the European Union, and it was an analysis of requirements for metadata, not specific to books in any way. It was about all sorts of e-commerce in intellectual property. So it applied to music, it applied to film, it applied to books. It was very theoretical. You could think of INDEX as a kind of philosophy project about e-commerce. ONIX really began in 1999 with a project from the American Association of Publishers called Online Information Exchange. Now, this took ideas from the four preceding projects, from EPIX, from BIC Basic, from INDEX, and from the XML specification. And it combined them and it produced not just a list of data elements that you should communicate, but also a practical method of communication. Now, EDItEUR was involved in that development, and during 1999, a specification was produced. It was published in January of 2000. Now, that version 1 has long been obsolete. In 2001, version 2 was released. That was also retired some while ago, although there are still a few people using it. In 2003, Onyx 2.1 was released, and there was a little revision of that in 2004. 2009, Onyx 3. And we're now at version 3, revision 2 of Onyx 3.0. So there have been a couple of little revisions over and above that 2009 version. Now, Onyx has developed, so has the documentation. This is the documentation from the original Onyx 1.0. That was a paper document, spiral bound, as you can see. When Release 2 came out, the documentation was all PDF, and these days, for Onyx 3, the documentation is mostly in the form of HTML files, although PDF versions are available. Onyx is very widely used across North America, but Canada and the US. In Western Europe here, Eastern Europe and Russia, there's a significant community of people using Onyx, and it's growing quite fast in the Asia-Pacific world, in Japan, in China as well. The current status is that most people in Canada are using Onyx version 2.1, revision 02. That's the most widely deployed by far in Canada and the US, and probably also in the UK here. But Onyx 3 is growing in importance. Onyx is quite a large standard, quite complex, but it's not so complex that it's out of the question for a very small team to develop. It's included in a lot of off-the-shelf systems, but a little team of 1 or 2 in-house developers can do something very useful with Onyx as well. The standard itself is managed by EDItEUR. We provide all the Onyx-related material, the specification and documentation, some XML tools and so on, free of charge. Anybody can use it all around the world. It's covered by a very permissive license that says you can do anything with Onyx, but if you change it, don't call it Onyx. That's pretty much what the license says. And anybody can use it. However, I would say that membership of EDItEUR supports development, and members of EDItEUR help identify new requirements. But EDItEUR can't control Onyx. EDItEUR doesn't change Onyx on a whim. The move from 2 to 3 or any of the minor changes are all discussed by national user groups around the world, and that ensures that any changes have a very broad international applicability. I can't add something into Onyx that makes it only suitable for use in France. That would be not only very silly to do, but also it's the sort of thing that the national groups ensure won't happen. The national groups ensure that any changes are very broadly useful across the whole Onyx community. And for big changes, there's a steering committee which is about ensuring the stability and defining the strategy for future versions of Onyx. Now, BookNet Canada facilitates a Canadian national group. And we also get input from BTLF, who facilitate a Canadian-French national group as well, into those steering committees and national groups. Now, 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, the national committees and the International Steering Committee agreed that support for version 2.1 could not simply go on forever. Version 3 has been out for a few years now, and the sunset date for version 2.1 was announced 3 years ago, and in fact has just happened. So certain elements of support that EDItEUR provides have now been removed. So let's look at some of the differences between 2.1 and 3. Let's first of all look at this at a very high level. First of all, I would say there were probably 8 major areas where ONIX 3 differs from ONIX 2.1 and improves on it. First of them is block level updates. Now, I won't say much about block level updates today, but they are a way to reduce the amount of data that needs to be sent. Every time something changes in your metadata about a particular book, with ONIX 2.1, you need to send all the data about that book all over again to update it. So to update one thing, like the spelling of the author's name, you need to send all your information about that book. In ONIX 3, that's no longer true, and block level updates allow you to send just a small part of the data. If only one thing changes, then you send just a small part of the data. ONIX 3 is designed from the outset to work much better with digital products. If you think back to the timetable, when was ONIX 2 and 2.1 designed? It was in the 2001-2002 era. And at that point, everybody had a fairly clear idea of where ebooks were going. But they were wrong. And ebooks developed in a slightly different direction. So whilst ONIX 2.1 has some allowance for digital products, it doesn't really work terribly well with the ebook market of today. ONIX 3 is designed from the outset with today's ebook market in mind. ONIX 2 and ONIX 3 differ in the way that they deal with sets and series. We'll look at each of these in much more detail in a few minutes. ONIX 2.1 and 3 differ in the way that they handle sales rights. These are the territorial rights. You can sell this book in that country, but you can't sell that other book in that country. ONIX 3 is much more flexible about marketing collateral. This is the material like cover images, short and long descriptions. Now, of course, ONIX 2 can deal with those, but ONIX 3 is more flexible and allows you to deliver more different types of marketing collateral. Uniquely, ONIX 3 allows you to deal with data in a multilingual way. With ONIX 2.1, if you were selling a book in English throughout Canada, then you might want to be delivering metadata both in English and perhaps also in French. If you were a bookseller in Switzerland, you might want to be delivering data in German, in Italian, in French, in English, and in Romansh. All 5 of those languages are widely used within Switzerland. And in ONIX 2, that would have required 5 separate data records for each book. In ONIX 3, a single record for the book can include all of the different languages. ONIX 3 is much smarter about the way it deals with related works. So this is the way that a first edition is related to a second edition. This is the way that a translation is related to its original, or the way that an abridged version is related to its original. ONIX 3 is much more flexible in the way it deals with those. ONIX 3 is designed, ONIX 3 is designed from the outset around the idea of complicated international markets for books. It's a much better fit to today's global book trading market than ONIX 2.1. Above all, ONIX 3 really represents a decade's worth of accumulated experience. It was designed many years after ONIX started being used, and it builds in a lot of knowledge that was gained during that period. There is a more extensive support for XML tools, more rigorous ways of checking that your XML is correct. And I'd say also one big change is that there is a lot of guidance for global best practice. In ONIX 2.1, there was, of course, a best practice guide. BookNet Canada, in fact, produced a very good and commendably brief best practice guide. However, it was different from that used by BISG. And BISG's was different from that used in France or from that used in the UK. And so there were, over the years, there was a development of a number of different, well, perhaps you could call them dialects of ONIX. Slight differences in the way ONIX was used from country to country. The global best practice guide is really aimed at bringing that together to make ONIX 3 more internationally interoperable. Now, I don't want to overstate the case here. The differences between those dialects, between ONIX 2.1 in Britain and ONIX 2.1 in Canada, are actually quite small. But the Global Best Practice Guide was and is a large undertaking. It's actually rather larger than the specification itself. It has a lot of stuff like this in it, very detailed descriptions and definitions of a lot of the data elements. It tells you exactly what a consumer announcement date is. It tells you what a trade announcement date is. And it sets some expectations about how those data elements should be treated by senders and recipients of the data. The Best Practice Guide also has a lot of quite detailed worked examples like this, showing you how you should use the contributor element. And it also has a number of diagrams that will be appearing on your screen in a second that show you how the XML is structured. Now, this sort of diagram, in a sense, looks quite challenging on screen at the moment. That, in fact, is the complete structure of a single author or contributor within ONIX. But I have found in dealing with many people around the world that diagrams like this actually do help them understand the structure of the data. So how do we go about migrating from 2 to 3? Well, let's not think about that quite yet. Let's think first of all about going from ONIX 2.0 to 2.1. This is something that quite a number of people did, maybe 10 years ago now. Now, the interesting thing is that ONIX 2.0 and 2.1 are not really that distinct. 2.1 was fully compatible with 2.0. All that happened was that certain elements from 2.0 were deprecated, they were discouraged. There was an element called EAN13 in 2.0, and that was maintained into 2.1, but that element was discouraged, was deprecated from 2.1. You could still use it, but you shouldn't really use it. Instead, there was encouragement to use a bunch of new composites. Now, these are data structures within ONIX, and the composite called product identifier replaced the data element called EAN13. It also replaced a number of other data elements as well. So there was, in ONIX 2.0, there were maybe 5 or 6 data elements, and in 2.1, there was one composite called product identifier that replaced them all. The old way could still be used, but the new way was to use product identifier. The composite was much more flexible, much easier to keep updated in the standard. Of course, 2.1 also brought along a lot of new functionality. There were new bits in sales rights, there were new bits in product form detail, and these made 2.1 better, more expressive, much more flexible. Now, here's the question. Is your 2.1 really just 2.0 in disguise, or has it been brought fully up to date by using these new elements like product identifier or main subject? If your 2.1 is really just 2.0 in disguise, then your migration is going to be more difficult. If your 2.1 is fully up to date, then your migration is already half done. Now, what about 2.1 to 3.0? remembering that you might already have done a good chunk of it already by bringing 2.1 up to date. Well, 2.1 and 3 are distinct messages. There's no backwards compatibility. And this is caused by the fact that those old elements from 2.0 have actually now been taken out. They're not just discouraged, they've actually been taken out. They're no longer valid. And that means there's actually fewer tags in version 3 than there was in version 2.1. Fundamentally, it's a simpler message. Onyx 3 has also continued that train of development. A lot of the things that made 2.1 better, we've gone further. There are new composites. There's more flexibility. There's the introduction of blocks. This is a continued story of development, but it's development in a very consistent direction. And of course, 3 has lots of new functionality. A lot of it has to do with either ebooks, digital products in general, multilingualism. Importantly, all of the new functionality is optional. You're not forced into doing new stuff, by and large, but you are forced into not using those old elements from 2.0. Those have been taken away completely. So there's a huge amount of continuity between 2.1 and 3. At least half of 2.1 is unchanged from where it was 8, 9, 10 years ago. On screen now, you should have a list of Onyx 3 data elements. Now, this is perhaps the first half of the message, and we're still at a very high level. But you'll see here that if you're familiar with Onyx 2.1, most of these terms will be very familiar to you. I've highlighted a few in yellow. These are the ones which are either new or have been subject to change. The white ones, there's essentially no change. So there's a minor change within product form. DRM and usage constraints for ebooks, that's new. Product parts, minor change. Collection titles, that's new. So you'll see that quite a lot of the message, in fact, and sometimes some of the hard stuff like contributors, that's not changed at all. This is the second half of the message. Now you'll see here, again, some white things that haven't changed, some yellow things that have changed, and also one red thing. Now this reissue details is something that was in 2.1. It is still in 3.0, but it's now deprecated, and that means that next time round, in another decade, we'll be taking it out entirely. In fact, I would strongly recommend anybody who's going to migrate to Onyx 3.0 does not use reissue details at all. There is genuinely no need for it, and the reason it's been deprecated is that there are better ways of doing everything that you could do in reissue details. Anything you can do within reissue, it's better to do it somewhere else. So you should now have a fairly familiar diagram on your screen. This is the Ishihara test for color blindness. I'm hoping that all of you on screen, on the call, can see the number 5 on screen. That generally means that you haven't got a problem with this kind of color blindness. If you see the number 2, please go and see your optician. But it's here to remind me that there are either 5 or 2 different types of change between Onyx 2.1 and Onyx 3. And we're going to look at those 5 different types, or maybe 2 different types, depending how you count them. The first type of change, I'd characterize it as spring cleaning. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll try and explain. In Onyx 1, so we're going back 15 years now, in Onyx 1, there were these 2 tags, ISBN and EAN13. And these 2 tags were maintained through 5 different versions of Onyx, up until 2.1. They were still valid in 2.1, even though they were deprecated, they were discouraged. along came the product identifier composite, and in 2.0 and 2.1, this could be used at the same time as those old tags. But now in 3, the old tags have been taken away, and you do your ISBNs, you do your GTIN13s, you do proprietary identifiers, always using the same product identifier composite. Now, you could have done this in ONIX 2.0, or you would have been forced to do it in ONIX 3. Really, ONIX 3 is just saying, well, you now have to do what you should have been doing for the last 10 years. And in fact, all the ONIX I see has already made this change. I don't think I've seen the EAN13 tag for a long, long time, many, many years. Here's another bit of spring cleaning, in fact. In ONIX 2.0, there was a tag called audience code. But there was also a composite called audience that did basically the same thing. And in fact, it's still there in ONIX 3. I would strongly recommend that you use the audience composite rather than the single tag. The single tag, I seem to remember, is deprecated in ONIX 3. It was not deprecated in 2.1, but it is now deprecated, and so use the composite instead. It is very easy to make that change, and we'll have a look at how to do that change in a moment. Here's another change that you're kind of forced into. In ONIX 2.1, there is a tag called availability code. And to be honest, it's a bit of a nightmare because it combines two very different things. It combines availability from the point of view of the publisher and availability from the point of view of the distributor. Availability code, because of that, is a very uncomfortable mix of different codes that mean different things to different people. Availability code, you were discouraged from using that in ONIX 2.1. It's now been taken away from ONIX 3, and what you have now is two codes, publishing status and product availability. And these are very clearly different things. The first, publishing status, is essentially the availability from the point of view of the publisher. Is it in print? Is it out of print? Whereas product availability is the availability of copies from the point of view of the wholesaler or the distributor. Is it in stock? Is it out of stock? The old availability code combined these two things rather uncomfortably. ONIX 3 separates them out. And again, you could have done this and should have done this within ONIX 2.1 as well. So ONIX 3 is forcing you to do something that could have been done at any time within the last decade. So there's a certain amount of spring cleaning here, of taking away elements that have been discouraged for many years, and we've now taken them away completely. The second type of change between ONIX 2.1 and ONIX 3 is some judicious renaming and reordering of the various XML tags. Here on screen, I'm hoping you can see the structure of an author, of a contributor within ONIX 2.1. This is very straightforward. The contributor has a sequence number, a role, which means they wrote the book, a name, an identifier for that person, because you might have two different authors of the same name. So give them unique numbers. And there's a little biography at the bottom of the screen. This is very familiar, very normal ONIX 2.1. Now let's look at the same thing in ONIX 3. And you'll see, first of all, that actually it looks very similar. There's not much difference. In fact, there are three differences visible on screen. The first is that well, maybe you didn't notice, so let's go back. If you can see on screen now the ONIX 2.1, you'll notice an element in the middle called Person Name Identifier. It's a composite that holds, in this case, a proprietary number, a proprietary identifier for this author. In ONIX 3, person name identifier becomes just name identifier. It's kind of trivial. All we've done is change the name. The reason we've done that is that we realized that these identifiers can apply not just to people, but also to corporate authors. So change the name of the tag to reflect that. You may also notice that the name itself, in this case my Sherville, used to appear in ONIX 2.1 above the identifier, before the identifier. Whereas in ONIX 3, it appears below the identifier. This is really about consistency. In fact, it turned out that this was almost the only place in ONIX where the text appeared before the identifier. Everywhere else, it was identifier first and then text. So for a matter of style, because there was a tag changing anyway, it was useful to change the order of the tags because that meant it was more consistent with other parts of ONIX. There's a third change on this screen as well, and that's the treatment of the character O with an umlaut. In ONIX 2.1, you were encouraged to use what we see there in red, which is an HTML named character entity that ends up being an O with an umlaut. In ONIX 3, what you get, or what you should use, what you're encouraged to use, is a real O with an umlaut. And in fact, those named character entities can't be used with ONIX 3. It encourages you to use a rich character set and the real character. The third type of change is restructuring for better consistency and better flexibility. In fact, you saw little of that already within the contributor element. But let's look somewhere else in the message. And I'll pick out this as an example of better flexibility. In ONIX 2.1, what you've got is a tag called publication date, and a tag called year first published, and a tag called on sale date. That's a kind of sales embargo. Do not sell it before this date. Now, what if we wanted a new type of date? 7 or 8 months ago, somebody asked me to add a pre-order embargo date. That was a date that you could not reserve a copy. You couldn't place an order with an online retailer for delivery in 3 months' time. They needed an embargo date before which you could not place orders. Now in ONIX 2.1, that would have meant inventing a completely new tag. But in ONIX 3, it was completely trivial to add a new pre-order embargo date. In fact, it was so trivial, and this is true, I did it by accident 3 months too early. Now, in ONIX 3, the way that dates are handled means that we can add new dates, new types of date, simply by creating a new record in a code list. So you get a new number, like 19 or 21 or something like that. New dates can be added just by repeating publishing date again with a new role. Change the code list, and we've suddenly got a whole new category of dates. So in this case, both screens, the 2.1 screen and the 3.0 screen, are saying much the same thing. 3/4 of the way down the screen, publishing date role 01, that's the publication date. Publishing date role 02, that's the on-sale date, or the sales embargo date. Publishing date role 11, at the top of the screen, that's year first published. Very simple. And it's a consistent structure that can be used again and again and again. And if we want new types of dates, just about adding a new code list entry. Becomes very simple. The structure is more flexible. And by making it more flexible like that, it means that we don't necessarily need to keep revising ONIX often in order just to add new dedicated data elements. Another example of the restructuring is the way that ONIX 2.1 handles rights. This looks fairly familiar, and I think that's something like this book can be sold, it's got exclusive rights around the Commonwealth, but in this case, not including Canada. Now, in ONIX 2.1, you can also do things like this. This says, this book is for sale in Canada and the US, and it's not for sale in Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. But where does that leave France and Germany? Where does that leave Mexico? In fact, whilst this is perfectly good on ONIX 2.1, it doesn't tell you what you need to know, particularly if you're a global ebook player who can sell books all over the world, potentially. ONIX 2.1 opens up an interpretation problem. Do you assume that you can sell it everywhere you can't? Or do you assume you can't sell it except everywhere you can? So different people take different assumptions here. In ONIX 3, one more thing to say about ONIX 2.1. This is the structure of sales rights in ONIX 2.1 and various tags that you use. All this does is describe a geographical area, the area within which a certain set of rights apply. But here's the problem. In ONIX 2.1, there are 4 different parts of the message where you are describing a geographical area. There's sales rights, there's supply detail, which is the geographical area within which a distributor or a wholesaler operates. There's price, that's the geographical area within which a price is valid. And there's market representation as well. I don't think that's used much in Canada. The thing is, they all do the same job. They're describing a geographical area, but they all do it in a different way. They use different tags. They use different structures. No 2 of these are the same. In ONIX 3, this was re-engineered so that every time you describe a geographical area, you use that territory structure with countries included, regions included, countries excluded, regions excluded. It's very flexible, but you importantly use exactly the same structure whether you're dealing with sales rights or price validity or the shape of a distributor's exclusive area or market. It's consistent. It's also more flexible. The other difference here, you can see on screen now how territory is used. This is much the same as the one we had a couple of slides back. This says, this book can be sold, sales rights type 01, in Canada and the US. It cannot be sold in Great Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, sales rights type 03. And ONIX 3 then requires you to say something about the rest of the world. That thing at the bottom, ROW sales rights type, is required unless you have world rights, in which case it's unnecessary. But in this case it's saying, I can sell in the rest of the world, but I have non-exclusive rights, so other people might well be selling very similar products. Now, understanding that many, many publishers do not have good enough information, or they might have good enough information, but it's locked in a filing cabinet or in a series of emails. It's not a structured database of their territorial rights. This means that rest of world sales rights type could be difficult. In some cases could be next to impossible to deliver accurate data. And luckily, there's a way out of this, because ROW sales rights type 0, it's a very important option, only available in ONIX 3, and what it means is, I don't know, or possibly, I'm not telling you. There may be good reasons for not telling somebody what your rights are, maybe because you're trying to sell them to a third party. So, rest of world sales rights type 0 allows you to say, well, I'm not sure yet. I may be able to provide better data later, but right now, I don't know. And that, of course, means that the migration then becomes easy, because if you don't know, and you can express that in the ONIX. Here's another example where ONIX 3 is actually much briefer, much more compact than ONIX 2.1 could be. This is a book which can be sold in the continental contiguous 48 states of the US, not including Hawaii and Alaska. And it cannot be sold anywhere else in the world. So it can't be sold in Hawaii, can't be sold in Alaska, can't be sold in Great Britain, and so on. If you wanted to say this in ONIX 2.1, regions excluded is not allowed. So you'd actually have to list each of the individual 48 states, one by one by one by one by one, each of them as a kind of regions included. This ability to say the US except for 2 states makes certain complexities much simpler to do. I should also say that ONIX 3 means that the simple cases remain simple. This means I've got world rights, and it's no more complex. In fact, it's slightly simpler to say it in ONIX 3 than it is in ONIX 2. Okay, the fourth type of change between ONIX 2.1 and ONIX 3. Now, this is more of a sort of developmental thing. XML hasn't stood still. XML was designed in 1997, 1998. And so when ONIX 2 came out, it was less than 5 years old. Development in the XML world has continued, and so ONIX 3 really takes account of that. It brings ONIX a little more up to date with the way that XML is used in other industries and other contexts. So it moves away from the idea of using doc type and the document type definition file, and recommends that you use XSD schemas, is the XML schema definition format. It recommends that you use Unicode, the wide range of all the characters from essentially all of the writing systems around the world, not just Latin 1 or ASCII. You can still use Latin 1, but the recommendation is to use Unicode. And those named character entities that I mentioned earlier on, like ampersand OUML, semicolon, standing for O with an umlaut, those have gone away, and the recommendation is to use the proper O with an umlaut. All of this is in line with much broader XML developments. Okay, so the fifth type of change, structural changes. And there are actually 2 of these. This is the 2 from that Ishihara test. There are 2 sorts of tricky changes. The first is around sets and series and main titles, and the second tricky change is around markets and suppliers. Let's tackle sets, series, and main titles first. So everybody's familiar with this series, and maybe I should say, in fact, this is a set. People often call this a series, but it is, in strict terms, a set and not a series. And this is how you would often describe it in ONIX 2.1. You might use the set tag instead of the series tag, but fundamentally it'll look like this. Now, in ONIX 3, this has changed. So what have we tried to change? Well, first of all, we've tried to get rid of a number of anomalies that were there in ONIX 2.1. For example, sets and series differ in the way that they're described, and yet publishers often don't care about the difference. Chronicles of Narnia is often described as a series when in fact it's a set. So we've brought these things together. This is how it would be described in ONIX 3. It's just a collection. It doesn't matter whether it's a set or a series. They are all just called collections. Now you see there that within that collection we have title detail, and that describes the title of the collection, in this case, the Chronicles of Narnia. We've split off the prefix, the word the, that's not used. You could do this in ONIX 2 as well. But fundamentally that's a title element with a title type and a title element level. And this gives you a clue about how ONIX 3 treats titles. It thinks of them more as a hierarchical thing, that you might have at the top a collection title. And then at a lower level, you have a sub-collection title. And then at a lower level than that, you have the title of the actual book. And then at least conceptually, a lower level again, you might have the title of a particular chapter. But actually that's not much used. But we do have these different element levels for the collection title, maybe a sub-collection title, and then the title of the actual book. So the collections can have multi-level titles. It's also the case that the products can be in more than one collection. They can be in an order or not in an order. All of the facilities that ONIX 2.1 provides for describing sets and series are in collection. Nothing was lost there. Well, where do you put the title? Well, the title goes a bit lower down. With luck, that'll scroll onto your screen or just appear now. And you'll see that below the collection, you now have another title detail. You'll see there was a title detail for the collection at level 02, and there's a title detail for the book itself at level 01. So The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe now has a title prefix, but it's at level 01, and that means it belongs to the book. It's a little more wordy than ONIX 2.1, but the structure of it is more predictable. Now, why is this difficult? Well, it's difficult because of this. This is another way of doing collection titles. So this is a book whose title is Workbook 6, but it's in a collection called Focus on Maths, and yet there is no collection tag. You'll see on screen there's a title detail, and then there are two title elements at different levels. Title element level 02, Focus on Maths, level 01, Workbook 6. We've seen two different ways of doing collection titles, and so there needs to be a way of choosing between them. Which of them is correct? The two different ways: as a title element within collection, or just as a title element within title detail, using that element level tag. And there is a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is this. Well, think about The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. If I mention the title of that book, you know exactly which book I'm talking about. I don't need to tell you that it is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe within the collection The Chronicles of Narnia. The collection title is not an integral part of the identity of the product. The product has a good identity. I can say The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, you know exactly what I mean. You know the identity of the product without me telling you what the collection is. On the other hand, if I said to you, oh, I read Workbook 6 last week, you don't really know which book I'm talking about. I have to tell you that it's Workbook 6 within the series Focus on Physics, because there's another Workbook 6 in Focus on Maths, and another Workbook 6 in the series called Focus on Chemistry. So, in that case, the collection title is an integral part of the identity of the product. So we use the first method, that is with a separate collection tag for Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and we use the second method, that is without a collection tag, just using the different levels for Focus on Physics. This is difficult because there is no equivalent in ONIX 2. It's something new. And that means that any IT systems you use have to have a little bit of development work in order to support that choice. Is the collection title an integral part of the identity, or is the collection title something a bit optional that the identity is okay without it? And in that latter case, you use the collection tag. The second difficult area is around markets and prices. Now, I don't have a big, long XML example because anything I could present on screen wouldn't explain it, to be honest. It would take several screens worth of data. But fundamentally, ONIX 2.1 describes suppliers, and then for each market they operate in, it describes the market in terms of a list of countries. So the supplier and then the countries that supplier operates in. ONIX 3 turns that structure on its head. It describes the list of countries, that's the market, and within that list of countries, it describes the suppliers who operate there. Now, this isn't that difficult in terms of the underlying IT, but it is difficult conceptually because it's changed from the way that 2.1 used to do it. 2.1 used to look at the supplier as being more important than the market. But these days, ONIX 3 looks at the market and then says, well, there might be several suppliers that operate within that market. The structure has been turned on its head. And this, again, will require a certain amount of development work within any IT system. So how might we tackle a migration project? Well, here's an outline that I would use. I'd first of all concentrate on bringing 2.1 up to date. You might have done all this already. You could have done anything on this screen at pretty much any time within the last 10 years, bringing your 2.1 up to date. Don't use any of those deprecated dedicated elements. Use composites. Use those 3 or 4 part structures rather than the dedicated elements. And in terms of your data supply, delta updates. So that is supplying records when something changes rather than supplying the ONIX for your entire list of books every week. That would be a full feed. Delta updates means only supplying the books where something has changed every week. And that makes the delta updates much smaller. In ONIX 2.1, you can use a rich character set like Unicode and UTF-8, and you can use HTML or XHTML tagging in text elements. Do all of those things and you bring your ONIX 2.1 up to date. That prepares you for the migration, but you're still using 2.1. So the next step is the migration itself. So this is where you step away from 2.1. First of all, deal with the simple things. Basically, the first 4 sorts of changes that I talked about. That's things like person name identifier just becomes name identifier, or the order of a tag changes. They're not all that easy, but for the most part, relatively straightforward changes to tag names, tag positions, or the way that a tag works in context. And then there's the tougher stuff. I've listed 3 here, where I said there were 2 earlier. Well, the first one is sets and series becomes collection. The third one is that change in the structure of suppliers and markets. ONIX 3 treats the markets and then suppliers within it. ONIX 2.1 does it the other way around. I've also listed sales rights here, and that's not tough because of the way ONIX has changed. It's tough because the quality of the data that a lot of publishers have is not always very good. These things, the simple stuff and the tough stuff, get you to ONIX 3. But it gets you to ONIX 3 that really just conveys the same data as 2.1. And then you can begin to tackle maybe a phase 2. Once you've implemented ONIX 3 using just the data that used to be in your old 2.1, you can then begin to add new functionality. It might be part of the same project, or it could be a kind of phase 2. Look at your ebook licensing and the restrictions around what you can do with an ebook. Look at providing richer collateral material. Look at providing block updates. I said I wasn't going to mention them. I lied. These hugely reduce the amount of data you need to send out, and it hugely reduces the amount of data that the recipient, the guy at the far end, has to deal with. And I should say, although we talk about this as a migration, it's not really. You don't have to switch off 2.1. The same data can produce 2.1 and 3 in parallel. So you don't need to arrange for everybody who you deal with to switch on the same day. It's actually not a particularly difficult thing to do to support 2.1 and 3 at the same time. But what does the migration get you? Well, we've talked about many of these things, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. First of all, greater consistency. Now, greater consistency in the way that you produce the data also means much greater consistency in the way that the data is interpreted at the far end. You can be much more confident that the person at the far end will understand what you meant because the structure of the data is much more consistent. Occasionally, ONIX 3 requires you to say something like a rest of world sales rights statement that make it much more certain that the interpretation is going to be correct. There are also improvements in consistency where, for example, contributor identifiers, it's a number that you give to the author because you might have two authors with the same name. They used to be limited to just personal names, but now they can be used with corporate authors as well. So more consistency, more simplicity. And that means better consistency in the way the data is interpreted. In general, within ONIX 3, there's usually just one way of doing things. Whereas sometimes in ONIX 2, there were maybe 3 different ways of doing things. And that made it very, very difficult for recipients of the data, because they had to look at your message and say, oh, have they done it that way or have they done it this way? The implementation and best practice guide also helps here. ONIX 3 gives us a lot more extensibility. The fact that it uses data composites, little structures of several tags, means that new types, whether they're new identifier types or new date types or new roles, or maybe new types of rights, can all be added via a code list change. It means we don't have to have specialized tags, and it means that there's less disruption if we need to add new functionality. ONIX 3 has already been through a couple of minor updates, 3.0.1 and 3.0.2, and they were introduced with virtually no fuss. They added new functionality, not just through code list changes, but also the introduction of new tags. But that was easy because the structure was designed with extensibility in mind. We also have that new structure, particularly around ebooks. If your business is with ebooks, then you should be using ONIX 3 because it's a lot better and a lot more precise than ONIX 2. You can say things like, this ebook, well, you can read 10% of it before you pay, or you can print only 10% of it, or maybe you can print 10% per month, or you're a library and you can only lend it out to your patrons 24 times for a maximum of 2 weeks. Or maybe you just want to rent the book. Setting prices for rental can only be done properly in ONIX 3. Now, I don't know about Canada, but in the UK, there's a movement towards making some books what's called open access. So free to use, and they're actually paid for, often they're academic books, and they're paid for by the research funders. The scientist does some research, and they're funded by someone, maybe by the government, and then publication of that research is also funded by the government so that anybody can read the results of the research. And being able to link from an ebook to the license under which it's published is vital for that sort of open access book. because there's lots of other new functionality as well around ebooks. Content types is more flexible as well, and that's used a lot with ebooks. We've got some new functionality around collections. A couple of anomalies I didn't mention earlier, sets and series. Well, sets can be multi-level. You can have one set and then a subset within it and maybe a sub-subset within that. You can't do that with series in ONIX 2.1. You can with ONIX 3. Collections can be nested inside other collections. In ONIX 2, series could have contributors, but sets couldn't, and there was no sense in that. In ONIX 3, collections can also have an order. Now, to be fair, they could have an order, so this is book 1, book 2, book 3, in ONIX 2.1 as well. But if you think about the Chronicles of Narnia, you may know that people think that the books should be read in a certain order. And that isn't necessarily the same order that they were published. And it's definitely not the same order in which time passes within Narnia. So there's a kind of narrative order for the series of books. There's a publication order for the series of books. And there's perhaps a recommended reading order that a teacher might set. And these different orders can all be expressed in ONIX 3, but not in ONIX 2. Contributors. Well, this is possibly the single most requested new feature of the latest version of ONIX 3, being able to associate a contributor with a place, and a very detailed place, down to city or town level, not just by country. And contributors can be associated with multiple places. So Canadian author Michael Ondaatje, place of birth, Sri Lanka. Place of current residence, and in fact citizenship, I believe, Canada. But he was also educated in Britain and began his career here. And you can specify these down to city or town level. The only thing you can do in ONIX 2.1 is associate an author with a country. If you provide some collateral material, cover image or a description of the text, you can specify in ONIX 3 who this is intended for. This might be a description aimed at librarians. This might be a description aimed at normal consumers. And this might be a description aimed at bookshop buyers, merchandisers. And you can say this description is only to be used during the month of March, maybe because it refers to a specific event or something like that. Now, that sort of specificity, use from until, is something that you can't do in ONIX 2.1, and being specific about the audience can only be done to a limited extent in 2.1. ONIX 3 also corrects a few things that I'd classify as errors. In ONIX 2.1, you refer to the resolution of an image, but the resolution of the image actually depends how big you print it. So in ONIX 3, images are sized by pixel size. ONIX 3 can have publisher and imprint identifiers. Well, you can have those in ONIX 2.1 as well, but you can only have one of each in 2.1. If you happen to have multiple identifiers for publisher, then you can list them all in ONIX 3. You can have specific product contacts. So this is the person to contact about the author tour. This is the person to contact about co-op marketing. That is the person to contact about an accessibility query. Perhaps you want a copy of the Word file for a blind or partially sighted reader. All of these product contacts can be listed in ONIX 3, but not in 2. More clarity about those sales rights and restrictions, product status or availability, all much clearer and easier to interpret in ONIX 3. New functionality around markets, particularly of interest in Canada, I suspect, because it gives you a much simpler way and a much more easy to interpret way of defining what get loosely called local market publication dates. So this is an availability date in Canada that might be a month after availability in the UK, or could be the other way around. New functionality for suppliers. Suppliers' own coding is useful. That's a code that's applied by the distributor or by the wholesaler. They sometimes provide lists of their core books. These are the ones they expect to sell most, and that can be included in ONIX 3. ONIX 3 gives you a certain amount of compatibility with X12 stock reports. So how many copies does the distributor have in stock, and how many copies are selling per week. And you can do that in ONIX 3, but not in 2. And ONIX 3 is more flexible around price. You can have rentals. You can have coded or tiered prices, like Apple would use. You can have comparison prices. So that is, well, this book is £7, but it used to be £9, or this book is $5, but the equivalent product is $9, something like that. So lots of new functionality, lots of more consistency about the way things are interpreted. But you do have to do a little bit of work, particularly around sets and series and around markets and suppliers. So why update? Well, first of all, it's not as difficult as most people assume. Developers I have spoken to who have been through a migration project have all said, I mean, this is essentially without exception, they've all said it was easier than they thought at the beginning of the project. There's lots of improvements in the message. There's some tricky areas. Well, there's also some improvements in the XML tools and block level updates. You're looking forward to something that means you're sending much less data around. There's also a couple of more things to bear in mind. One of them is the sunset date that we've just been through with ONIX 2.1. Now, there was 3 years' notice of that, and those people who migrated a year ago or 2 years ago are reaping some benefit now. EDItEUR has reduced its level of support for ONIX 2.1 and will continue to reduce it a bit more. It will become gradually harder to use ONIX 2.1. 2.1 will never stop working, but we won't be further developing it, and we will be removing more and more support. Finally, there is a small risk of not upgrading. What happens if your biggest customer decides, well, 2.1, that's a legacy system, it's no longer supported, so you must supply us ONIX 3? IT directors are often very keen to get rid of support. And so it is possible, I wouldn't overstate this, but it is possible that some big customer will say, well, 2.1's gone away now, it's been sunsetted, so you must only send us 3. And by the way, you've got a month. Now, whilst 2.1 will never stop working, 2.1 will get gradually less and less useful as people in the market, as recipients in the market, as intermediaries or resellers begin to switch their support to 3.0, it will gradually get more and more difficult to support.
But we do have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any. No one's typed in any yet. Okay, well, thank you, Graham. That was excellent.
It's my pleasure. And as I said before, if there are questions that occur to you over the next hour or the next day, then, of course, please email them. My detail was on screen a moment ago, graham@editeur.org. And graham@editeur.org is our email address. Or, of course, you could email Booknet Canada and ask the questions there. I'm sure they will pass it on, and I'll try to answer them.
Excellent, yes, and thank you so much for taking time to present today, Graham, and thank you to everyone who came and joined us. And we will have the slides up as you mentioned, very soon. We'll send them out to you guys. And we will have a recording of the webinar available as well on our website, editors, and our e-news, blog, social media channels, which are up on the screen, so you can look for that very soon. And if you have any feedback on the webinar, suggestions for future topics, please do get in touch by emailing media@booknetcanada.ca. So thank you again to everyone, Graham especially, and have a great afternoon.